Hello, and welcome to another episode of Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler, and today I'd like to talk about Liberty ships. Maybe you heard the name, but don't know quite what they are. Well, I've got a model of a Liberty ship for you here. It's a regularly commercial, available, reasonably priced plastic model, and the Liberty ships were uh, made to fill in the gap early in World War II. The British had suffered terrible shipping losses, and the convoy was one way to stop those losses, although we were very slow to adopt convoy in both world wars. Admirals seemed to prefer big battles, that type of thing, with battleships and aircraft carriers and not convoying freighters. But still, the need for new ships was immense. New shipyards all up and down the east and west coast to do this. Now they had a British design of between the wars, maybe even World War One design for a cheap uh, freighter with a steam reciprocating engine because turbines were slow and expensive to make. Very few maritime nations, actually made turbines of their own. So this was a reciprocating engine, of course, steam powered. And the thing about it also was that all of as many plates as possible were straight. You can see how straight this ship is, especially the hull, especially because that took time and everything to pound out a curved hull. Now, of course, they had to have some curves, of course, especially around the stern. But basically, it was flat plates and welded together. And they said that these ships were rolled out by the mile and cut off by the yards. They used Detroit mass production methods to make ships, which had never been done before. They make one ship at a time, and I mean, of course, maybe like destroyers, they might make 20 or 30 destroyers of a certain class, but made by different shipyards and everything. Although many other shipyards did make the Liberty ships. In the end, there were 2,700 Liberty ships built. Okay, that 2,710 Liberty ships, and at their peak, the shipyards could turn out two a day. All right, uh, all new methods of manufacture have never been done before in shipbuilding. For example, the deck houses often, certain deck houses were built upside down because that was easier to put in the wiring, the plumbing, that sort of thing, rather than have to reach up, over the ceiling to do it. Nobody thought of that before. Built upside down, then flipped around right side up and bolted to the decks. I should also mention that so much of it was welding, very very little um, riveting. And welding is stronger. It actually melts the metal plates together and gives a very strong bind. However, there is a tendency to crack with welding. A number of these ships cracked in half and were lost that way. So this is wartime. I mean, it's serious business. And in fact, let's say, just look at the date of how many were lost here. It was about uh, 200 Liberty ships were lost. And today there are only four in existence, and two are museum ships. Um, the idea was if they could make two runs from the U.S. to Britain, especially if there were some in the Pacific, but mainly they were for the run, going across the pond with Britain. If they could make two round trips, they figure that they had, they paid off. So 200 of them were lost. Many, of course, being torpedoed. The worst runs, of course, be to Murmansk from the States to North Russia, and Murmansk and Archangel to help the Russians. I mean, these ships were loaded with tanks and food, spam. I remember reading about one woman, Russian woman in Murmansk, and she had this jar of this exotic American food called peanut butter. She didn't know what it was, so she wouldn't eat it, but she kept it as sort of memento of the Great Patriotic War. So I mean, that's everything from peanut butter to U.S. Tanks were shipped that way. I should also mention the need for Britain to have these ships and Russia. Britain had made a conscious decision in the 1840s repealing the corn laws. Corn in England means grain, like wheat grain. They don't eat corn over there for a long time. I don't know if they even still eat that much corn, but what we call corn, they call maize. And they decided let's be cheaper to import the grain from, excuse me, from United States, Canada, Australia, and Russia, and that would be cheaper than to grow it because they used to subsidize British farmers because that the land that was a part of the British. A number of countries were like that. Russia, uh, Germany. That if you're not a farmer, if you're not a part of the land, in England, of course, the land was owned by the land. The very word landowners means rich, the landowning class, a term that's meaningless in this country. But anyway, they kind of left the countryside in England to go over to sort of sports field for riding into horses, riding into hounds. The un, what Oscar Wilde called it, the unspeakable in pursuit of the uneatable. But I mean, they did have growing, obviously, farms growing it, but nothing like it could have been. Okay, and so they were even though they had a major effort in both world wars to grow their own food, they couldn't entirely. So those freighters, those victory ships, and other freighters, of course, were absolutely essential for the survival of Great Britain. In World War I, they were within about 6 weeks of no food, and the convoy saved them then. In World War II, it got kind of like that, but convoy plus the Liberty ships meant that it did not get to that, only 6 weeks left. I saw a photograph of England in World War I, in which the indicated convoy system was so effective that there were people selling roadside stands in England selling pineapples cheaper than potatoes. Just I'd probably some kind of a fluke, but still that showed how well the convoy system worked. So you have convoys plus victory ships. That would be, of course, the recipe for victory. I should also mention that I actually was on a Liberty ship. Well, actually, there were two of them, as I said, and one actually went to on the anniversary of VE Day, the 50th anniversary. It went to Normandy and anchored off the coast, and proper ceremonies and historical remembrances were made. Well, I was on a Liberty ship, the Zebulon B. Vance, and this was after World War II. And my parents were in the military, and I was a kid, tagging along. And they had converted the Zebulon B. Vance to a troop ship, and the dependents as well. I must say, we lived very well. It wasn't like first class, but we had diner service, and there was a mess hall. Now, I'm sure the troops weren't quite like that, but the dependents, we had like semi-private cabins and waiter service in the dining hall, that type of thing. But here's the catch, in a way. It took us 16 and a half days to cross from Bremerhaven to the port of New York. 16 and a half days. And we went through the tail end of the hurricane. And as the stern of the Zebulon B. Vance popped up the end, this is a single screw engine, you'd hear it thumping. And there wasn't quite the give in the ship that maybe you'd expect if it had been riveted instead of welded. There were remarks about lady welders. Many women went to work building these ships. So African Americans also. Here's one case, like everybody was mobilized for war. And building these ships and many other ships, of course, would get you out of the draft. So, you had a lot of people building a lot of ships during the war. We just turned them out, say, run them out by the mile, chop them off by the yard, was the way it was. So after 16 and a half days, we made it to the port of New York. In those days, you went into a port, you saw New York, or you saw the Statue of Liberty. There it is. We're back in the States. Now you fly in. And the Statue of Liberty is just a tourist attraction, which is fine. I mean, I'm not arguing against that, but landing in an airport is nothing like arriving in the port, like Port of New York, or some other ports that have some kind of welcome to them. And I should mention also that when we landed, there was a band waiting for us. When we left Bremerhaven, we got to New York 16 and a half days later. There was a band waiting for us, but it was a Liberty ship converted to a troop ship. So anyway, just want to talk about there's actually a book about them called "The Ships That Saved the World." Now, I don't know if I go that far, but they probably saved the British from really hunger and having to go short in supply, and of course, so the Russians as well. So this was just this sort of bridge across the Atlantic and up, as far north as North Russia or into to Great Britain. Of course, when we landed at Normandy, then of course on the continent of Europe itself, and this is what supplied them everything from peanut butter to tanks. Well, thank you for listening. I'm Stan the History Man. I hope to hear you'll just be listening to me again. Thank you very much.